I don't want you to feel like you can't read this if you already don't believe that Jesus is God, because that's not really crucial. Like, we're reading this to understand what we are. We're reading this to struggle with God. Okay, so hi. Um, I wanted to make these videos because I feel like oftentimes the Bible is something that's really intimidating to people and overwhelming, maybe. And a lot of us come with our preconceived notions about what's in the Bible without really reading it. But sometimes what we need is a guide. So, Dante had Beatrice to guide him through hell and purgatory and heaven. And so I would like to be your Beatrice and guide you through one of my favorite books of the Bible, which is John, the Gospel of John, and kind of just go through it chapter by chapter and explain how I see it and why I really fell in love with both the book as a piece of great literature and also got to see a new view of God through that. So, the thing I would also like to qualify these talks with is that you don't really need to believe in God to listen to them. And I don't think John wrote this to people that necessarily already believed that Jesus was God or that he was anything but, just come open-minded, I guess, with your ideas, but try to be open to maybe new ideas about who Jesus is. I don't have any fancy degrees. I don't think that you need to read the Bible coming at it with a lot of other books or a lot of other information. But I do really, really like this book. It's more of a reference book than a reading book, but it's really, really interesting. It's called The Social Science Commentary on the Gospel of John. It's a nerdy title. But it's by Bruce J. Molina and Richard Rohrbaugh. And they really talk about how, we can't read something without bringing our ideas and our society to that thing that we're reading to understand it, which is natural and normal. But sometimes it's helpful to understand the context that the author was writing the book. And John was writing this book many years after he lived with Jesus. So he had, some ideas of his own that he brings to this. As a work of literature, I think John was writing in a very specific way, in a specific context, and we're not in that context. But it doesn't mean there isn't something to be understood from that. So, one of the things in their introduction about John that they talk about that I thought was really interesting and sort of changed the way I thought about John was that John uses a lot of insider language. So there's like lots of keywords that he peppers throughout his book, like light and darkness and love and all kinds of ideas that we'll see as we go through the book of John, that he's kind of trying to signal a certain group of people. And we see this in different subcultures in our society. We see it in teenagers especially like to use slang that kind of keeps the right people in and the wrong people out. Sometimes those wrong people are parents or older people, other people that they don't like. But we all do that in our society, and it really becomes apparent that he is signaling to a certain group of people about brand new ideas, and he wants to get these new ideas across. So I would just like to start reading chapter by chapter together, and you can read in any version that you'd like. I'm using the free Bible version. It's actually translated by a friend of mine, and lots of Bible translations are copyrighted, and he did this translation because he felt that the Bible should be free. So this one is not copyrighted, and you can also find it on the YouVersion Bible app if you would like to use your phone, or you can get a hard copy. So starting with John 1:1. In the beginning, the Word already was. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning, he was with God. Everything came into being through him. Nothing came into being without him. In him was life, the life that was light to everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot extinguish it. God sent a man, John. He came as a witness to explain about the light, so that everyone might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to witness the light. The true light was coming into the world to give light to everyone. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world didn't know who he was. He came to his own people, but they didn't accept him. But to those who accept him and trusted in him, he gave the right to become children of God. These are the children born not in the usual way, not as the result of human desire or a father's decision, but born of God. The Word became human and lived among us, and we saw his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son, full of grace and truth. John gave his testimony about him, shouting out to the people, "This is the one I was telling you about when I said, 'The one who is coming after me is more important than me, for before I ever existed, he already was.'" We have all been recipients of his generous nature, one gracious gift after another. The law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. While no one has ever seen God, God, the one and only, who is closer to the Father, has shown us what God is like. This is what John publicly stated when the Jewish leaders sent priests and Levites to Jerusalem to ask him. Oh, pause there. So that was 1 through 18. So John's preamble, I think, is really interesting. It's kind of, John starts with some poetry, and you might notice that he talks a lot about light and darkness. So this is a bit of poetry, and it's definitely a lot to unpack, and I don't want us to get bogged down in that, because I feel like, if we're already overwhelmed by reading the Bible, we start with this pithy bit of poetry, and it can become even more overwhelming. But I think there's some important things that I think are really beautiful in that section before we move on to the rest of the first chapter. One of my favorite parts of that is that in the beginning was the Word, and it's mirroring how the Old Testament starts in Genesis. And I think that's purposeful for John that he did that. He's saying, like, there was an important thing happening when God created the world. And this is the second part of that important thing, that God is creating something new. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And there's lots of different ways to understand the Word, but one of my favorites is that the Word is logic and thought and ideas. And before we had a vague idea of what God was doing and who God was, and now we're going to understand what God thinks in a way that we really haven't been able to before. And again, I don't want you to feel like you can't read this if you already don't believe that Jesus is God, because that's not really crucial. Like, we're reading this to understand what we are. We're reading this to struggle with God. And I think sometimes people come to the Bible thinking that it's a book telling you what to do and what to think, and that shows they really haven't ever read the Bible, because the Bible very rarely tells you what to do and what to think. It does give you some outlines for a way to live your life, but it's far from telling you what to do, and even further away from telling you what to think. And most of it is a struggle to understand what it's even saying. So I hope that we can struggle through this together. But I do love that God is revealing himself and helping us understand what he's thinking, and that we can decide what to think from there. A couple other things that I really like in this particular section: the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot extinguish it. We all know, most of us would admit, that there's real evil in the world. that we've seen in history, some particularly evil times, but that this light can't be put out by that evil, this goodness, using that light and darkness as metaphors for good and evil, and that eventually the light will win, that evil cannot extinguish this light, even though it will try, as we'll see, really hard to put this light out. I guess the other idea that I really like in this is that he came to his own people. People are disgusting. They're sweaty. They're stinky. Particularly like at this period. I mean, we do a really good job of showering every day and being less disgusting. But people are gross. And to think that the God of the universe became a human being, and in other translations, they can use that he came to his own people. He pitched a tent among his own people, right in the center of all of that sewage and sweat and disgustingness and meanness. And that's kind of a crazy concept. That he wanted us to know him so much that he would come to us. So that's how John is starting. There's lots of other amazing ideas in there, but again, I don't want to get bogged down too much in that really beautiful piece of poetry. It's something that I love about John, because I feel like John is writing a piece of great literature. You can come to it again and again, and every time you travel through John, you'll find something amazing that you didn't notice the first time, or the 10th time. However many times you go through it, it's sort of, you'll always find something new and interesting. So John kind of maps out what's going on here, that God is wanting to reveal himself to us, and that he's picked a very strange way to do so. You know, maybe you don't think that Jesus is God. Maybe you think he's just a great person, or he had something really profound to say. And again, that's fine. John definitely believes that Jesus is God, which he's mapping out here right from the very beginning. And that John, as we learn from other John the Baptist, is Jesus' cousin, as we learn from some of the other Gospels. And that, so we will pick up in verse 19 and keep reading through that rest of chapter 1. One of the things I really like about how John writes this book is that in a modern context, we've all seen movies like this where they show you a scene, they cut, they show you another scene, they cut, they show you another scene, and you're left a little bit confused about how these different little vignettes tie together. And I feel like John is sort of doing that same thing. He's kind of showing you a clip here and a clip there, and he's making his point through these different experiences of different people. And when you're watching the movie, you wonder, like, how do these things connect? And you don't really understand until you get to the end. And if we approach John that way, that he's made his argument. He thinks that John thinks that Jesus is God. But he wants to show you why. And so he presents that argument through these little clips, these little different stories, and makes that argument, and then lets you struggle with it and say, like, what you think is up to you. But here's what I think. So picking up in John 1:19. This is what John publicly stated when the Jewish leaders sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" John declared plainly and clearly without hesitation, "I am not the Messiah." "So then, who are you?" they asked. "Elijah?" "No, I'm not," he answered. "Are you the prophet?" "No," he replied. "Well, who are you then?" they asked. "We have to give an answer to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" "I am a voice calling in the desert. Make the Lord's way straight," he said, using the words of the prophet Isaiah. The priests and Levites sent by the Pharisees asked him, Why are you baptizing then, if you are not the Messiah, or Elijah, or the prophet? John replied, I baptize with water, but standing among you is someone you don't know. He is coming after me, but I am not even worthy to untie his sandals. This all happened in Bethany beyond the Jordan, where John was baptizing. The next day, John saw Jesus approaching him, and he said, Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is the one I was talking about when I said, A man who is coming after me is more important than me, for before I ever existed, he was. I didn't know myself who he was, but I came baptizing with water so that he could be revealed to Israel. John gave evidence about him, saying, I saw the Spirit descend from heaven like a dove and rest upon him. I wouldn't have known him, except he who sent me to baptize with water had told me. The one you see the Spirit descend to and rest upon, he is the one who baptizes with the Holy Spirit. I saw it happen, and I declare that this is the Son of God. The next day John was standing there with two of his disciples, and he saw Jesus passing by and said, Look, this is the Lamb of God. When the two disciples heard what he said, they went and followed Jesus. Jesus turned around and saw them following him. What are you looking for? He asked. Rabbi, which means teacher. Where are you staying? They asked. Come and see, he told them. So they went with him and saw where he was staying. It was about 4 p.m. They had spent the rest of the day with him. Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, was one of these two disciples who had heard what John had said and followed Jesus. He went at once to find his brother Simon and said, We have found the Messiah, which means Christ. He took him to Jesus. Looking directly at Simon, Jesus said, You are Simon, son of John, but now you will be called Cephas, which means Peter. The next day Jesus decided to go to Galilee. Jesus found Philip there and told him, Follow me. Philip was from Bethsaida, the same town that Andrew and Peter came from. Philip found Nathanael and told him, We have found the one that Moses wrote about in the law, and the prophets did too, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. From Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? Nathanael wondered. Just come and see, Philip replied. As Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said to him, Look, here's a true Israelite. Nothing is false about him. How do you know who I am? Nathanael asked. I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called, Jesus replied. Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel, Nathanael replied. You believe this just because I told you that I saw you under a fig tree? Jesus replied. You will get to see much more than that. Then Jesus said, I tell you the truth. You will all see heaven open and angels of God going up and coming down on the Son of Man. So, basically, John the Baptist is out baptizing people, which is kind of a common Jewish thing, of sort of refreshing your life, of like ceremonial cleansing. And the religious leaders come out to see what he's doing. It's a really chaotic, traumatic time right now in Israel. Rome has taken over. Rome is good at several things, and that is taking over places and war and making sure everybody knows who's boss. And Israel doesn't really like to be under their authority. They're, frustrating subjects, I would think, from a Roman perspective. And they have this really obnoxious idea, from Rome's perspective, that they aren't under their authority, and that really soon God is going to deliver them. They've been in several bad situations under other governments, and God has delivered them in the past. And so they feel confident that if they can get their poop in a group, so to speak, and follow God's laws that he's laid out, and that he will come and deliver them. And they're looking very specifically for this person, known as the Messiah. So John comes along on the scene, not the John that's writing this book, John the Baptist, and he is kind of a crazy person. And a lot of the things he's saying are sort of way out there culturally for them. But he's also attracting a lot of people where he's baptizing out in the desert. And so people are traveling outside of the city to visit him and see what he has to say and listen to him. And it's really stirring up their hearts and they're rekindled anew to take up this idea that we should rededicate our lives to God. And it's also then, because of the crowds, it's also attracting the religious leaders. So the religious leaders are coming out to see what's going on and what all the commotion is about. And so then in this chapter, as we read, they're asking him, okay, but who are you? What gives you the right to talk about this stuff? Are you the great prophet Elijah from the Old Testament? No, he says. Are you the Messiah? Because they're expecting the Messiah to come at any day. The person that's going to release them from the bondage of the Romans and give them back their kingdom and make things right again. And John the Baptist says, no, I'm not. But he's coming. And really, John the Baptist is kind of a nobody. He is saying these scandalous things. He's calling out the religious leaders because the religious leaders are corrupt. And I think a lot of us come with a lot of bad taste in our mouth about religion because we all see the corruption of people. We all see the corruption of religion. And we tend to get those things confused. We think maybe religion and corruption go hand in hand. But I would like us maybe to put that on the table and say, people are corrupt. People are bastards. And people mess things up. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't an ideal. And I think we could all admit that there is an ideal. And that we very often fall short of the ideal. But, like every good story, this one has bad guys. And I think we could get behind the fact that a lot of times religious leaders are the bad guys. So the religious leaders come out and talk to John the Baptist. And he explains that, no, he's none of these people that they think he is. He's somebody making the way. He's preparing a path for the Messiah. Because the Messiah is coming. And so then one day Jesus comes out and, they are cousins. But I don't really know that John the Baptist knew that Jesus was the Messiah. And I think that would pretty much be a difficult thing to say, yeah, like my cousin is the Messiah, my cousin who I've known all my life. But indeed he is. He asks John the Baptist to baptize him, and he does so. They have this kind of weird moment where the Spirit of God descends on Jesus, and John the Baptist is sort of stunned. And then we move on in the rest of that part where several of John's disciples decide to follow Jesus, which was a fairly common thing, to find someone that you could learn things from and sort of follow them around and listen to them. It's definitely like a different culture. But these are interesting disciples, which we will learn later in the book. They aren't really who you would necessarily pick as disciples. I like to think of the roughest people in our society. These are fishermen. They're workers. Fishermen don't have a high status in this society. They're stinky. I don't know if you've ever been around fish, but fish are disgusting. And they're laborers. And they kind of have washed out of school. They're not, who you would necessarily pick to be your followers for a new idea or a new way of thinking. But Jesus does pick these people, and that's kind of curious. In our society, I was trying to think of a correlation to fishermen, since I don't live in a town near the sea, and we don't have fishermen. Most of us don't live in this agricultural society. But I was thinking about the roughnecks that work
on the oil rigs near here, they're rough and they're not necessarily educated people. They work hard, they're dirty, they stink. Um, their priorities are maybe a little different than I would say that mine are. They make a lot of money, they spend a lot of money. Uh, it's just a different kind of subculture. And if I imagined God embodied in human form looking for people to follow him, I don't necessarily think that he's not going to pick the people I guess I would pick. And that's probably a good thing. And we learn something about God and we learn something about Jesus because of the people he picks to follow him. And this part where it says Nathaniel is like, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" I find that sort of amusing. He's a little mouthy, and Nazareth is a rough place. And so Nathaniel has his own preconceptions about this guy. And when he meets him, Jesus kind of calls him out on that. And he's like, "Oh, well, obviously you're the Messiah." And Jesus laughs at him again and says, "That's all that it took? Okay. Well, you're going to see lots more exciting things than that by the time we're done." So that first section started out with that bit of poetry, which I think is something we can come back to as we get further in the book and kind of look at. And then that second part was about John the Baptist baptizing, the attention that he's drawing for his new ideas, and calling out those corrupt religious leaders, which it might be unfair to call them corrupt. We literally just met these people. Okay, so in this book. So I am coming at it knowing a lot more. But the religious leaders have come. They've asked John some questions. John has called them out on the floor. And then Jesus starts calling his disciples. So those are sort of the first three little clips that John has laid out for us as we continue this road to meet Jesus and see what he's really like. So I hope that we can continue this in chapter 2.